Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a really cool discovery that kind of flips what we thought we knew about learning on its head. It turns out your brain's final call on whether a lesson was hard or easy, well, it might be decided in just the first few minutes. Let's get into it. So, I want you to think about the last time you learned something really new. A new instrument, a piece of software for work, whatever. When you look back on it and think, man, that was tough, what exactly are you remembering? Are you basing that on the one part that really stumped you? Or maybe how you felt right at the end? It feels like a simple question, right? But the answer, according to some new research, is probably not what you'd guess. Okay, so to really unpack this surprising find, we need to get a handle on a huge idea in learning science. It's called cognitive load. It's that invisible mental strain you feel when you're trying to cram new stuff into your brain. So cognitive load theory, in a nutshell, says your brain only has so much bandwidth at any one time to deal with new information. It's finite. And if a lesson or a task asks for too much of that bandwidth, you hit a wall. You go into cognitive overload, and real learning pretty much just stops. And the place where all this mental juggling happens, that's your working memory. The best way to picture it is like a little workbench in your head. It's only got space for a few items at a time. If you try to pile on too much new information, things just start to get messy and fall right off. But here's the thing, not all that brain strain is created equal. You can basically split it into two buckets, helpful strain and harmful strain. The helpful load is the good stuff. It's the natural inherent difficulty of the topic itself. That's called intrinsic load. And it's also your own effort to connect the dots, which is germane load. The harmful stuff, the extraneous load, that's just junk. It's mental clutter from, say, a confusing textbook layout or a distracting environment. The whole game is to minimize that harmful stuff. Okay, so we've got this idea of cognitive load. With that in mind, let's look at what we thought we knew about how we remember difficulty. For a very long time, the leading theory pointed in one very specific direction. So, let's say you sit through a whole course. Some parts are a breeze, some parts are brutal. When it's all over, how does your brain come up with that one single feeling of, that was hard, or that was easy? Does it do the math and average everything out, or does it just latch on to one particular moment and let that define the whole thing? For years, the evidence all pointed to something called a peak difficulty effect. Just like this quote from the study says, when people were solving problems, their memory of the whole experience was basically determined by the one single hardest part. Your brain doesn't bother with averages, it just remembers the peak struggle. That was the rule. But, and this is a big but, all that research was on problem solving, which led to a huge question. Does that same rule hold true when we're learning? To figure that out, researchers came up with a really clever experiment. They wanted to see if that peak difficulty rule would survive when you're not just solving a puzzle, but actually learning something totally new. The setup was just brilliant in its simplicity. They created 3 quick lessons about space, an easy one, a medium one, and a hard one. They got about 100 students and split them into 2 groups. Group A got the lessons in order, easy, medium, hard. Group B got the exact same 3 lessons, just in the opposite order, hard, medium, easy. And after each little lesson, the students rated how hard it was, and then at the very end, they gave one final overall difficulty score for the whole experience. So, this was the moment of truth. If the old peak difficulty rule was right, then both groups should give a pretty similar final rating, right? Because they both experienced the exact same peak, that really hard lesson. The order shouldn't have mattered at all. But is that what actually happened? Well, the results were not what anyone expected based on the old theory. In fact, they uncovered a totally different mental shortcut our brains are taking. Instead of remembering the peak moment of difficulty, the learner's final judgments were massively influenced by their first impression. This is a classic psychological bias called the primacy effect. What comes first sticks. And the data, it was just crystal clear. When they crunched the numbers, the single best predictor of that final overall rating was the score students gave for the very first unit they saw. Look at that predictive strength, 0.7. It's practically double the others. It didn't matter if that first unit was the easy one or the hard one. That initial feeling totally anchored their perception of the entire experience. So, the big question is, why? Why is learning different? Why does solving a puzzle follow this peak difficulty rule, but learning a new subject follows a first impression rule. The researchers think it all boils down to feedback and certainty. When you're doing a puzzle, the feedback is black and white. You either solve it or you don't. That moment of intense struggle on the hardest puzzle is a really solid, memorable event. But learning is fuzzy. It's ambiguous. How do you really know if you fully understood something? It's hard to tell. And because of that uncertainty, your brain just grabs onto the first solid piece of data it gets. That initial feeling of, okay, this is easy, or whoa, this is going to be hard. And it uses that feeling as an anchor for everything that follows. Now, this is more than just a neat little psychological quirk. This has some really powerful, practical lessons for how we all should be learning and teaching. We can actually use this knowledge to our advantage. So what's the takeaway here? Well, if you're a learner, just being aware of this bias is like a superpower. If a course starts off feeling impossible, take a breath, remind yourself it's just a first impression, and it might get way easier. And if you're a teacher, an instructor, or you design courses, the lesson is crystal clear. The beginning is everything. You have to start with clarity, with a manageable challenge to create a positive anchor for your students. And for any researchers out there, it's a bit of a warning. That one rating at the end of a lesson, it might not be telling you the whole story. So the next time you're teaching a class, or even just learning a new hobby or explaining something to a friend, remember this. Those opening moments matter so much more than we think. They don't just set the stage. They can literally define the entire memory of the experience. Thanks for tuning in to The Explainer.